This is the only video you are going to need for the rest of the fantasy football season when it does come to defenses. We'll start by quickly going over my top defenses for week 13, actually my top 13 defenses for week 13, and then get into the rest of season rankings for my top 32, all 32 teams for the remainder of the season rankings, as well as a list at the end of the video of the defenses we need to be stashing for the fantasy football playoffs that aren't rostered in a ton of leagues, but ones that you can get. So make sure to stick around at the end of the video for that. Hit that like button if you do appreciate me nerding out for these defenses. But coming into this week, the Denver Broncos are going to be my number one defense. They get a matchup against the Cleveland Browns, which is a very positive one. They are first in points allowed to defenses so far this year, isolated in turnovers specifically. The Broncos defense themselves have been a really solid unit so far this year. They are the defense 2 overall, averaging just under 10 fantasy points a game, and that is a lot thanks to Patrick Surtain. He is allowing the second lowest QBR per week to quarterbacks, and we know how bad and how vulnerable Jameis Winston is to throwing turnovers and making mistakes in general. If you isolate the Browns games with Jameis Winston so far this year, they're averaging almost 2 turnovers a game. That's insane, but that's great on the other side for the fantasy football defenses. This is a matchup here where we lean into the weaknesses of the Browns in their offensive line and making a bunch of mistakes. Go ahead and put them at the number 1 for this week. But the number 2 defense this week might come as a surprise to some people. It's going to be the Texans coming into a dream matchup here against Trevor Lawrence and the Jaguars. Regardless if Trevor Lawrence plays or not, they're still going to be at this ranking. If he doesn't play, maybe they move up a little bit more, but how much more can you really move up as the number 2 defense? Regardless, the Texans have 23 total takeaways this year, and the Jaguars have 16 total giveaways. Those are both really high numbers for both sides. Now, we do have to be realistic because the Texans are coming off a bad week. They just actually lost to the Titans 32-27. But there are a few reasons that I'm really not worried about this defense whatsoever in this matchup against the Jaguars. The first of all, that being DeMeco Ryans is a defensive-minded head coach. He's a bounce-back kind of head coach. By that, I mean his data as the Texans head coach, the fantasy points and general usage statistics of a player after a really down week increases a lot. Some of the highest in the NFL out of every head coach. And this is a number that we can probably apply to defenses as a total unit as well. Yes, wide receivers bouncing back is going to be a lot easier and a lot more predictable. As a defensive unit, it's a little bit less statistically proven. But the second reason here is that this game was a divisional matchup. If you know anything about divisional games in general, if you calculate every single divisional game since the beginning of time, they are always closer than games that are not in division. When we look at this week's matchup, they get the Jaguars. Again, they're top 5 in points allowed to opposing defenses this year. If we speed things up a little bit, we're going to have the Chiefs and the Colts tied up for the next defensive spot here. The Chiefs, they get a matchup against the Raiders, who have the worst turnover differential in the NFL. They're absolutely terrible on pretty much all sides of the ball. They've been dealing with quarterback troubles all year. They don't have a ton of offensive weapons that could possibly burn the Chiefs defense, and they have a really good solid unit on their own. The Chiefs are another defense that is letting up a little bit more points. As of last week, we just saw that they barely beat the Panthers. It honestly could have gone either way, but you can expect a bounce back game from this team when they are healthy, especially considering the talent they have on this roster. And the Colts, they are surprisingly high on this list. I'm not going to lie to you, because they get a matchup against the Patriots. We have to be hunting out these great matchups here. They've been extremely turnover prone all year, especially Drake May consistently. When he is in the game, he is very indecisive and throws a good amount of interceptions. This is where we start to see a little bit more of risk develop with these defenses though in the rankings, because the Colts, they have some playmakers, but they have been caught lacking in a good amount of their matchups and letting up a lot of big plays, so it is going to carry more risk. Then we're going to be dropping it down to the defense 5 and 6 with the Rams getting the Saints and the Vikings getting the Cardinals. The Saints, they're a very up and down team as far as an offense goes, especially now without Chris Olave for who knows how long. We have Taysom Hill partially at quarterback. Derek Carr, not the best guy, but the Rams, they have some playmakers, and the upside here is that Derek Carr is not a mobile quarterback and their offensive line isn't amazing, so there is a good amount of opportunity for sacks in this matchup. And again, he doesn't have a ton of offensive weapons to go ahead and burn this defense. I honestly like their chances to go over 5 sacks in this matchup. It is very, very real in the range of possibilities. With the Vikings themselves, they're an amazing unit. They're the number 1 overall fantasy defense this year, averaging 11.8 fantasy points per game. Brian Flores has used his playmakers absolutely amazing. He makes stops. He's pretty much everything you want in a defensive coordinator. And now he gets a Cardinals matchup, which is definitely more on the risky side. Like, it's not the best matchup of all time. The Cardinals have been pretty up and down this year. One day, Kyler will be having a masterclass against what's supposed to be a really good top defense in the Jets, putting up, over 30 points. Then he comes back in a positive matchup against the Seahawks and does absolutely nothing. So there is that volatility risk with him, but the Vikings, at their price, we're keeping him this high in the Week 13 matchup because they're just so absolutely amazing. And if we do happen to get a down week from Kyler Murray and the Cardinals, it'll be that much better. But then we're going to have the Bills, Commanders, and Seahawks to finish out the single digits of these rankings here. The Bills, they do get a tougher matchup against the 49ers, but again, They don't have the best turnover differential as far as this year compared to previous years. They are coming off a bye week. We really start to get into the risk for real in these defenses now. There are games where the Bills completely do fall apart. We have to be real with that. Their secondary is absolutely amazing. They don't allow a ton of fantasy points. There are the games here and there where they just don't put it together though. And the 49ers is a good, capable enough offense to exploit the Bills defense. But Brock Purdy is questionable coming into this matchup. That will definitely change the scope of things. If Brock Purdy does happen to miss, which I don't think is very likely, I will be moving this defense up. But for now, this is where they stay. But the Commanders against the Titans here, again, this does bring a little bit of risk because of who the Commanders are, but by no means do I expect the Titans to look anywhere near as good as they did against the Texans last week. Again, that was a divisional game. They're typically closer and a bit higher scoring, but that's the best I've literally seen Will Levis play in my entire life, in NFL terms at least. He's a bottom 5 quarterback in air yards per game, passing attempts, red zone completion percentage, red zone completions in general. Pretty much every passing statistic outside of his rushing numbers are bottom 5 in the NFL. The Commanders have been trailing off offensively and defensively as of late, but they possibly can get Marshawn Lattimore back this week. He is questionable, limited in practice. More than likely, he probably won't play, but if we know anything about Marshawn Lattimore, he is a lockdown corner, and if he does, he's going to lock up Calvin Ridley and definitely make this matchup a lot more of a favorable and safe one for the Washington Commanders. They can stop the run at a decent rate against any running back that's not named Saquon Barkley. That's a problem that a lot of teams have this year, but again, they bring a little bit of more risk because of who this team is. But the Seattle Seahawks is another team that's been kind of inconsistent coming into a great matchup here against the New York Jets. Their offense is absolutely terrible regardless of what the Jets look like. They can't move the ball. They don't have a great offensive line, and Aaron Rodgers isn't necessarily mobile. This matchup should be more low scoring on the Jets side, which is going to allow for more fantasy points to the defense in that aspect. Aaron Rodgers doesn't make a ton of mistakes as far as interceptions go, but we're going to be following that with the Buccaneers and the Chargers next. The Buccaneers get the number 1 best matchup of the week here against the Carolina Panthers and Bryce Young. Now, they probably can't call it the number 1 best matchup because Bryce Young has been looking a little bit better as of late, but he still has absolutely no help at the wide receiver position. Luckily, the Panthers' weaknesses fit in really good with the Buccaneers because they are vulnerable over the top. The Panthers don't really have that many great wide receiver options, but they are top 10 in sacks this year, and they are great in quarterback pressures. They get a bit of a tougher matchup against the Falcons this week, but unlike the Buccaneers, they are first in points allowed to opposing offenses. They don't allow a ton of points, and they're 5th overall in sacks this year. So they have a lot of upside and internal success. Then we'll finish out the Week 13 matchups here with the Jets against the Seahawks, Cardinals versus the Vikings. Two defenses that I wouldn't necessarily run to start. We've had a bunch of games on Thursday and Friday, so there's not a whole ton of options left if you do need them. But now to the rest of season rankings. I'm going to go very quickly and put all of these on screen for you at once so you can see it, internalize it, and get the information you want from it. Very quickly in the S tier, these are all teams that have elite defensive units themselves and also some pretty good fantasy matchups as well as fantasy playoffs. If we look into the A tier, these are all teams that have a little bit worse of matchups, but still you can't start them in their spots and their defensive unit is still amazing. If you have specific questions about who to start or who to trade for, or whatever the case may be for the rest of season rankings for the defenses, let me know in the comments. I will be answering 100% of them. Then we'll have the middle class of defenses here with the B and C tier. This is about the last realm of defenses that I would be starting and rostering on my team for the rest of the season. Pick and play the defensive matchups. Make sure you start them in the positive ones. The negative ones, you can probably sit them out, but this is the last tier here. The D tier is where you start to get to the really negative ones. You don't want to be starting those guys. Possibly even sell your league mates on the F tier defenses if they're slow enough to go ahead and put them in and start because they're not good. They don't have internal success either and negative matchups. But now to probably my favorite part of the video, the defenses that are a little bit more slept on. They're not rostered in a ton of leagues, but they do need to be on our team and stashed for the fantasy football playoffs and possibly even as soon as this week and next week to start as well. That first defense here, we're going to be going with the Buccaneers. They have the easiest rest of season schedule out of all the defenses I'm going to mention here. In week 13, they get the Panthers. Again, great. Week 14, the Raiders. Possibly the most positive matchup of the year, honestly, at this point. The Chargers in week 15, I don't love that. We don't need to be starting them in there. Then the Cowboys and the Panthers, two positive matchups, even though the Cowboys are looking a little bit better as of now. Again, that defense is vulnerable over the top, so those Cowboys and possibly even Chargers defense matchups aren't going to be great, but you can't start them. They have great pressure rate on the quarterback. The second defense here that we need to be stashing for the rest of the season is going to be the Cardinals. Again, they carry a little bit more risk, but these defenses are rostered in lower percentages of leagues for a reason. This is why they're on the stash list. They get the Vikings in week 13, the Seahawks in week 14, the Patriots, the Panthers, and then the Rams in the fantasy football playoffs. That week 15 and 16 stretch is absolutely amazing. We need to be starting them in those matchups. If you can't get the other top defenses, they're going to be the one for you. I wouldn't be starting them against the Rams and some of these other ones, but they are 100% worth a stash. And then we're going to drop it down with the Colts here. Like I talked about with the week 13 matchups, they're going to be a team that we can stash for pretty much the rest of the year because they get the Patriots this week in week 13. That is absolutely amazing. Again, we know how bad Drake Drake May is as far as turnovers go. They get a bye in week 14 and then the Broncos after that in week 15. But again, 16 and 17, Titans and Giants, 2 matchups you want to be starting this defense in. Another stash defense here. We're going to be following that with the Falcons as our next defensive stash here. They're going to be a bit more of a spot start team. They do get a tougher matchup string here with the Chargers in week 13. That's a tough one. Vikings in week 14, a little bit tough again if Justin Jefferson is going to be playing. And then the Raiders, Giants, and Commanders in week 15, 16, and 17. The Falcons defense isn't amazing by themselves, but again, in these positive matchups, you want to be hunting for those. But if you're looking for the definition of a spot start defense, the Saints are going to be that option for you. They get a very tough matchup this week against the Rams. You don't want to be starting them. But then in week 14, they get the Giants. We've seen the team is just not really the best. Drew Lock, not the best. They don't have a ton of time in the pocket. But then we're going to get the Commanders, the Packers, and the Raiders. You can start them in almost 2 out of 3 of those matchups. They're going to be great spot starts. Again, the defense itself isn't amazing, so be aware of that. But that is going to finish off this video. I appreciate you guys sticking all the way through and nerding out over these defenses with me. I will see you in the videos coming later this week, and all glory to the man above.